You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 17, Thicker Than Water. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week, Mission Log Gene-ology explores the early TV writing work of a promising new recruit to the ranks of television writers, Gene Roddenberry, in the golden age of the medium, long before he created Star Trek.
This week, it's Gene's second script for the 1950s military series West Point, where brothers Joel and Robert Hamilton are in very different points on their journey through the United States Army.
And there's a million things they haven't done, but just you wait. Just you wait.
Hey, Earl, just FYI, it's the wrong Hamilton. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X, formerly known as Twitter and Facebook at MissionLogPod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now here's Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you very much, everyone. Give a hand to Norm. But me, I'm the damn fool who looked up this trivia. We've arrived at Gene's second script for West Point, a show on which he was a staff writer. Thicker Than Water aired on CBS on Friday, November 2nd, 1956, a mere 3 weeks after The Operator and The Martinet. Just for a fun bit of context, if you're wondering what else was on TV that day in 1956, West Point aired at 8 o'clock Eastern after My Friend Flicka and before Zane Grey Theater on CBS. It was up against The Adventures of Jim Bowie on ABC and The Life of Riley on NBC. The Dumont Network had recently signed off in August 1956, meaning that the former Dumont affiliate stations now had to scramble to program their own primetime schedules, with either locally originated programming or whatever was available in syndication. William Campbell stars as Cadet Joel Hamilton, the older brother. Gene would work with him again twice in Star Trek, first as Trelane in The Squire of Gothos in the first season of the original show, and William would return in Season 2 as Klingon Captain Koloth in The Trouble with Tribbles. In 1956, William was busy with movies, appearing with Elvis in Love Me Tender, and without Elvis in Backlash and The Man in the Vault. He was a couple of years away from his regular role as Jerry Austin in the TV series Cannonball, and of course Koloth and Trelane were still 11 years away. William Campbell went on to revive the role of Koloth in the Blood Oath episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine in 1994, and we lost him in 2011. Now, a warning for those of you looking for this on William Campbell's IMDb credits: West Point isn't listed there, at least it wasn't the last time I looked. Instead, it is attributed to a different William Campbell as that William Campbell's only credit. But there is no mistaking the voice or those eyebrows. This is definitely our William Campbell that we are familiar with from classic Star Corey Allen appears here as Robert Hamilton. This was Corey Allen as a 22-year-old actor whose most famous role was arguably already behind him. Just the year before, he had been Buzz Gunderson in Rebel Without a Cause, antagonizing James Dean throughout the movie before he landed this guest-starring role on West Point. On TV, he had already shown up in Dragnet, Stories of the Century, and The Loretta Young Show. Appearances on Gunsmoke, Darby's Rangers, Have Gun Will Travel, Men into Space, Sea Hunt, Bonanza, and Combat were still years ahead of him, as was a directing career that began in earnest with 4 episodes of Dr. Kildare in 1966. Corey went on to direct episodes of Mannix, The Streets of San Francisco, Barnaby Jones, and Quincy M.D. He would direct William Shatner in 1 episode of T.J. Hooker, and of course, Corey would direct 5 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, including the 2-hour pilot movie Encounter at Farpoint, as well as 4 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. we lost Corey Allen in 2010. If you've been wondering about Cadet Lieutenant Charles Thompson, who introduces each show, well, get ready for this. There's no such person. Actor Donald May appears as Cadet Lieutenant Thompson. May's character was the one constant cast member in the entire show, though he was present only for brief introductions and on a few occasions a coda at the end of the story. Donald would also go on to appear in Hawaiian Eye, Men into Space, and 77 Sunset Strip.
We were just going to look over the place.
I've got a brother in there.
Yeah, I noticed the name.
I want him to learn the system right off. No special favors. I want him to get his full share.
Yup, that's right. He's just another plebe.
Well, he's in your squad and your platoon. You'll be seeing more of him than I will. I'm depending on you, James. You too, Ed.
You worried?
I've fought his battles all through school. He's gonna have to fight this one alone. He has to understand that.
Right.
You got it.
Act 1. Welcome to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Your guide around the grounds is Cadet Lieutenant Charles E. Thompson, Company M2. But this isn't his story. This is the story of Cadet Joel Hamilton and his younger brother Robert, who has just enlisted and is on his way to West Point for the first time. At their family home, Joel tells Robert, "You're overpacking. You're not going to need all that. You're a plebe, and you need to be getting ready for 8 weeks of hell, not planning your off-duty wardrobe, because chances are you won't get to use it." Robert's still being cocky, though. Surely his older brother knows the angles, can show him a few shortcuts, right? That's a sir, no sir from Joel. The next day the train pulls into the station at West Point. Robert disembarks and is shown to his barracks, where he meets fellow plebe JJ from Kansas City. Robert kicks back and relaxes, like you're supposed to when you've just arrived at West Point. And that's when Joel comes in. Everyone else stands to attention. Joel is, after all, a senior cadet, but Robert? He's chillaxing. Joel gives him no quarter. You stand to attention and get that smile off your face, mister. But Robert doesn't even have the faintest idea how to stand at attention properly, and his brother dresses him down in front of his new bunkmates. JJ from Kansas City is trying a bit harder, but not hard enough. Joel lays down the law to his brother. "I am Mr. Hamilton to you, cadet." With that, he gives warning that he will be doing an inspection in 1 hour, and he's off. The cadet who showed Robert and JJ to their quarters gives Robert a friendly warning: don't push your luck. Outside the barracks, Joel confers with a couple of his fellow senior cadets and advises them not to cut his little brother any slack. He's worried that maybe Robert isn't cut out for the army. Later on, Robert pops off a wisecrack at his brother while he's supposed to be doing push-ups. "It's easier to stand there and watch than do it yourself, brother." "Sir?" Joel pulls him aside, tells him to drop and give him 20, and then he drops and does 20 right next to him. Actually, it's more like Joel drops and does 20 push-ups while Robert struggles to get in about a dozen. Joel takes this opportunity to remind his little brother there are no shortcuts and no easy ways out at West Point. Remember Tony, the cadet who showed Robert and JJ where they'd be sleeping? He tries to pull Robert aside for some more friendly advice. "This will go much better for you, and you'll feel a lot better about yourself if you just stick to your guns and show the senior cadets that you can take the worst that West Point could throw at you." But Robert argues there's got to be a way to work smarter, not harder. There's got to be a way to beat the system. Tony shakes his head. "Well, all right then. The only way the kid's going to learn is the hard way." The next day during formations, rinse and repeat. Joel's had it with the insubordination. He points out that he swore to defend the country and die for it if necessary, and he's just not seeing the same dedication to that oath in his younger brother. Get it together, or get out of the army while you still can. Act 2. Even Joel's fellow senior cadets are wondering, is Joel pushing his brother too hard? But he can't let up. He wants his brother to be the best, even better than him. And it's starting to look like he might get his wish. Robert starts passing inspections without comment, and over time his performance is much improved. But in a private conversation, Robert says that it's just a performance. He just wanted to show his older brother up. Joel is about to give his younger brother another epic tongue-lashing about duty and honor when both of the Hamilton brothers are summoned to Major Colley's office. It's bad news. The Hamilton brothers' father has died in a car accident. The brothers are on leave, effective immediately, and a ride home is being arranged. The Major knew the elder Mr. Hamilton well. They served together. The man the Hamilton boys knew as Dad, the Major knew as Captain Hamilton, who held a Distinguished Service Cross and earned a battlefield commission on the beachhead at Normandy. The Major knows that Captain Hamilton would have been very proud of both of his sons. But even once they're home, the two cadets Hamilton know they've got to be back at West Point the next day. But Robert's off his game at morning inspection, and he just can't drag himself back into the uniform. A little more kindly this time, Joel pulls him aside for a pep talk. He's seen the improvement, and he believes Robert has earned that uniform, and he needs to put it back on. Joel is being less formal and more brotherly. A manly handshake is in order, and when Joel withdraws his hand, he has left his father's rank bars in his little brother's hand, as if to make a point that Robert, too, could someday become Captain Hamilton. The end.
Snappy, sharp, to the point, polished, buttoned up, everything that you want from a plebe cadet. But even though he's not a plebe cadet, Earl did a fantastic job with that recap. Nicely done, Earl.
I'm glad I passed the inspection.
With white gloves. I do love that from episode to episode that we've done so far in West Point, I like the consistency of the opening of the show with Charles Thompson. Even though Charles Thompson, as you said in trivia, isn't a real cadet. You know, head to toe, picture perfect. He is like everything that you want to see as the poster child for a West Point officer.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if, like, the Army had to, the Department of the Army had to approve his casting, like they had approval over, every other aspect of the show. Did they have a say in casting at least this character who is representing them week after week, whereas everyone else rotates in and out with each story?
One of the things that I thought was interesting in the beginning, though, so again, I'm kind of fixating on the Charles S. Thompson character. He was pointing behind him, and he was talking about these rooms have been, at one point in time, rooms that housed very specific historical military figures, one of which was George S. Patton.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if any other cadet that gets those rooms, do you think that just by nature of who lived in those rooms prior to them, they feel like an extra obligation to do maybe just a little bit more in their career? It's kind of like, here's the energy of the room. This was Patton's room. Now you got to be just a little bit better of a cadet because you're in Patton's room. Because it's just they're just assigned rooms, right?
You've got to be 50% more all you can be than everyone else who's here trying to be all they can be.
I wonder if those cadets could basically give themselves their own promotion while they're there at West Point. Just in spirit of the of the officer who was in that.
I had the Patton suite. Thank you very much. Another thing, we were talking in the previous installment of this podcast about how West Point, the series, was basically kind of a soft recruiting tool for the young men watching at home. In the intro scenes, this is something I noticed in this episode. In the intro scenes with Cadet Lieutenant Thompson, did you notice that he is always kind of looking down at the camera as if he is addressing someone shorter than he is? The camera is always looking up at him. You talk about kind of an unspoken, young men, boys, this could be you. That's it right there. That camera angle says a lot without saying a word.
It's very much like the Uncle Sam poster, like, I want you. Like, that finger isn't pointing to anybody but the person that's looking at it.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just any of you, it's you. I want you to join the U.S. Army.
Now, early in the episode, one of Robert's fellow plebes pronounces the word cadet as Cadet. And I wonder if this was a weird choice by the actor, because here's the thing with West Point, and I'm not sure we said this last week. We're in a weird position with this show where we have the shows, but the scripts are not in the archive.
Right.
At the end of each show, screenplay by Gene Roddenberry scrolls up in the end credits. We know it's his show that particular week, but we don't actually have the scripts. And so I have no idea if this was a choice by the actor or if this was something that Gene specified in stage directions for the script.
He did spend time, as you said in previous episode, on set, on location, and studying kind of like what's going on, with the actual real life affairs that are happening on West Point. So maybe he heard somebody, because he's pretty adept at being able to, by osmosis, learn and then funnel that into his writing. So it's very well possible that was the case. But going back to Charles Thompson, he's getting a lot of coverage here. But one of the things that I thought, and to your point, was speaking directly to the audience that was watching, or we assume is the audience that's watching. He says, "This is where boys spend 4 years being turned into West Point men."
Yeah, I noticed that.
Not just any men. Not just any military men. West Point men. So I'm wondering, again, these are all examples of how you and I are creating this theory that this is, in fact, a recruiting tool for a specific purpose. But it did strike me funny because I was remembering another movie that I really enjoy called Starship Troopers. And there was, obviously, Paul Verhoeven had a very specific ironic message about service and sacrifice. And there was a recruiting officer that basically told some of the young recruits that he was signing in, for service. He said, "The mobile infantry made me the man that I am today." Then he rolls backwards in his rolling chair, and you notice that he's a double amputee, or a triple amputee, actually, because he also has a mechanical arm and hand. So there is a sense of irony here with what's being said.
There's a sense of irony with Starship Troopers, but with West Point, yeah, I think this was definitely the camera angle, turning boys into West Point men, which under absolutely no circumstances should anyone ever sing to the tune of Pet Shop Boys, West End Girls.
I can't now. I have to. I have to now. Not on this recording. This is your fault. Your fault.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. But yeah, I think there is definitely a thing going on here where you boys in the audience, this could be you. Look at how cool this is. Look at how awesome these guys are in formation. They're getting to carry guns around. And I noticed we saw more indications of what West Point actually is training you to do. And that's a point that I noticed in one of the other characters' statements to Robert. If these first-classmen scare me so bad, what am I going to do to a war? When I heard that, I was like, oh, okay, there it is, finally. Yeah. I came down hard on West Point the show last week because it was almost a frat house comedy, that first episode that Gene wrote. But this one, okay, we're finally acknowledging what the Army does.
Yeah, no, I think that was really smart of them to, in the scene, for all of the viewers or listeners out there that didn't get the chance to watch this, there's a scene where you have Robert, Joel's younger brother, and then this young recruit, and one who just is kind of like he's moving from non-enlisted to enlisted, and they all have these different points of view. And I think that it's fair that this scene speaks to the audience in that way, because not every single young man out there that's watching this show is going to be the gung-ho that they want to sign up. I mean, case in point, it's interesting that they use the establishing shot at the very beginning of this episode that has this wonderful 3-peak Tudor house in a nice suburban area for two men, one of which is already at West Point, the other one who's going to be a recruit of West Point. And the way that they frame this is the background for these two men to come from. It doesn't seem like these are the kind of audience members that need to go to West Point, right? Like, they don't need to really serve in that way. But I think it's framing the story in a very specific way by showing this particular house, setting, tone. Don't you think?
Yeah, and I think that's a shorthand for, okay, the kid who's about to go into West Point is kind of soft.
Mm-hmm.
And they are setting that up from the very beginning. And again, with an economy of visual cues, that means you don't have to spend dialogue setting that up.
Because it is plush, or posh, I should say. And I think that kind of goes into the aesthetic of all the realistic cadets that are there on the show. But, I think we made mention of that before in a previous episode. One thing, though, that made me kind of chuckle a little bit, there was a calisthenics scene where the new recruits are, with their officers in training. And they're all wearing their standard, typical calisthenics uniforms, white T-shirt, black shorts, black shoes, I think they were like Converse shoes. But the instructor literally had printed in block letters on their chest, Gym, G-Y-M. I'm like, okay. Just in case you forget who they are. No, that's not Jim. We're not damn it, Jim. It's Jim. All right, G-Y-M. I thought that was kind of funny. One of the things that I really like, though, about this era of TV, I really do like how much attention they pay to just the background scenes, the marching scenes, the formation scenes, and what everyone's wearing. Because they're kind of like a living time capsule of things that we just don't see anymore. It's kind of like museum-type history where you're just like, okay, that's what a pack looks like. That's how they put on and took off those uniforms at the time. Those are what the helmets look like. These are all the different types of nomenclature and standards, and symbols that the young men of West Point wore at the time. There's no one else, or nowhere else, I should say, that we can really see that live aside from these shows, since they're shot on location and with the approval and obviously curated by the United States military. So what do you think about seeing stuff like that? Or, does it give you a better sense of like wind wings, of this era of West Point, so to speak?
Perhaps, but I think you're right on the money in pointing out that this is another element of the show being a recruiting tool, because if being a big tough man isn't enough of a sell for you, look at all this hardware, guys.
Oh, yeah.
You could be toting this around.
So we're like moving into Act 1 into Act 2, and I thought that it was really, really interesting how we see Robert's attitude change from the end of the first act to the beginning of the second act. And I couldn't help but make another comparison or parallel to the kind of radical change that we saw in the character of Gomer Pyle in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Gomer Pyle was, he was played to perfection by Vincent D'Onofrio. Because there's so much of that just radical transformation DNA going on from Robert's story and why he's doing what he's doing, and how Gomer Pyle radically changed so quickly, but for obviously different reasons. Do you think in some way that this scene maybe informed that scene later on?
Well, keep in mind, war movies had been happening since the war. And so I think that transformation, we have a montage or we have a fade out and back in, some sort of time lapse in there. He arrived a boy, he emerged a man. That's
a West Point man.
A West Point man. That's almost a trope in the genre of military storytelling. It existed before this show. It existed before Full Metal Jacket. It's a common thing, but it's almost irresistible because you do see it crop up so much, even to this day.
But you think it was unique at the time, since these kind of shows were starting to be a little bit more ubiquitous with, again, a very specific audience that it was designed for?
Oh, yeah. At the time, you probably couldn't have done a YouTube supercut of that transformation. Well, also because you did not have as many examples of it as a recurring theme in military shows, military movies.
I'd love to look at the records and see if during this time when this was being broadcast, if we actually did see a tick up in recruitment or in the applications to West Point. Just, out of curiosity. Now, I know that this wasn't written for dramatic purposes per se, but I do like the scene where one of Joel's former or fellow officers kind of looks at him and says, "Hey, don't you think you're pushing your little brother a bit too hard?" I know that's the drama of it, right? Because someone has to tell Joel that, hey, look, even we, your fellow officers, don't push our plebes that hard. But it's true, though. These places, they push you that hard. So obviously you can tell that there's a shift in, remember, folks, this is a drama, and we're trying to tell you something. Or maybe Gene saw that. He's like, hey, you know what? I heard two officers talking, and I'm surprised that one of them said, hey, lay off that guy. You're laying it on a little too thick.
That's entirely possible. I think this may also be possibly an example of a trope that goes with this kind of storytelling. There's not a huge amount in this episode that, from a plot standpoint, is truly original. But where Gene is doing the heavy lifting is in building the characters within that story structure that is already a time-honored thing.
And I think that goes kind of hand in hand with probably one of the more poignant scenes of the episode, when Robert and Joel are told about their father's death, by their commanding officer. I think for the time that their reaction was appropriate. I think for the audience, their reaction was appropriate, even if I personally disagree with it, the way that they act, because I'm not them, and I wasn't raised like them. Because they weren't raised just by their father. They were raised by West Point. They were also, tangentially raised by what we bring up more often than not in Gene-ology, and that's the masculinity script. But the way that they reacted, the way that Robert reacted, and especially the way that Joel reacted, because he is the older brother, and he's probably like, okay, what am I supposed to think now? I'm now head of the family. I have these responsibilities. I have to take care of Robert. I have all of these things. And that just kind of like flooded himself to the point where he actually showed emotion. So I think that the amount of emotion that they showed in that scene was it spoke volumes of where they were mentally at the time, and the way that they've been conditioned.
Yeah, and William Campbell does a huge amount with his eyes there.
Totally.
I mean, the guest performances here are, everyone except Donald May as the cadet lieutenant in the intros is a guest performer on West Point. Mm-hmm. But there was not a weak link in this one. And it just... Yeah. I really do feel like with West Point, we're seeing Ziv get better at making these shows. They're better directed, they're better acted. I think we can argue that they're better written, certainly than I Led Three Lives, or some of the later Highway Patrol scripts, which the whole basis of this show is I have a bazooka. Here we're getting real characterization with some depth. And so, from Gene's scripts on up, the product is improving.
And I think that the way that it wasn't the end scene, but I think for me, it was like the emotional end of this episode, which it was very smart. The Hamilton's father, Captain Hamilton, didn't talk about his career, but he had this medal. And that pretty much is kind of like the totem of the Hamilton code of ethics. And Robert just passing that off, or Joel just passing it off to Robert in a handshake, that kind of said it all. That you really didn't even have to script more than that. It could have actually ended, I think, with that scene, because that's just, it's the icon of what duty, honor, and loyalty means to the family.
Yeah, and compare and contrast this. Remember the episode of Mr. District Attorney, where we get this super clean-cut ending? There was a cop who was killed, and his son is a police lieutenant, right. And he happens to be the one who gunned down his father's killer. Hey, right. It's all good. The scales are all balanced. That seemed so clumsy. This was elegant, and just there was so much emotion in it, even without a lot of dialogue. Ziv's getting better at this, and I don't know if it's just that more is being expected from the medium and Ziv is changing with the times, or if the entire Ziv organization is deciding we want to make better shows. All right, Norman, we're back in the Army now, and as much emotion as there was in the scene where the Hamilton brothers learn that their father has passed away, in the next scene, we have a fade out, we have a passage of time, and then we're at home with the Hamiltons. They're going through their father's stuff. Is Mrs. Hamilton emotional? No. I'm trying to remember, did she even really get any lines? I mean, we finally have a woman in this show. Did she say anything?
She basically said, "Can't you stay for a little longer?" And then she said...
I think that was almost her only line.
Yeah, and then I believe Joel said that we need to get back, to, campus, Ma, or something like that. And then she says, of course, you need to be there for the ceremonies, the graduation ceremonies. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, so no show of emotion there. Joel's good. Robert's good. No one's really torn up about it. And I wonder how much of that was baked into the cake of 50s TV. Don't upset the folks watching at home because we want them to stick around and see the commercials in between the acts. That's what this is all about. So stick to that masculinity script. Even you, Mom. Hey, you thought Vulcans were bad. Have you even met the Hamiltons? So, these people give very little indication in that scene, which just seems weird, because it seems like not a lot of time has passed since we've arranged for you to have a ride home. It doesn't seem like this is a week later or a month later and everyone's had time to process it. This is like the next day. This is within 24 hours of that. And, again, going back to our Hamilton in-jokes here, there's no indication that anybody's world has turned upside down.
I would love to be able to take a time machine back and watch this in the era that it was designed for and for the audience that it was targeted to. Because I think that, and up until a certain time, I think that these are very formulaic. Not to say that it's a good or bad thing, but you're dealing with, here's the thrust of the narrative. Here are some of the details. Here's some characterization. Gives them a little bit of, three-dimensionalism. But nowhere really in the episode, with maybe the one outburst of emotion, if you want to call it that, from Joel, hearing the news of his father's death. In the scene prior to that, didn't they just open a letter? It's like, here's a letter from Dad. He's fishing. So we don't see a lot of it, but I'm wondering if that in and of itself was a reflection of exactly what was going on in certain households at the time. Again, going back to the masculinity script, this was actually point 1 of the masculinity script, the 4 points of the paper that we reference on occasion here on Gene-ology that has informed us so much about the possibility of how young men, older men, would have thought and behaved back then. Point number one, quote unquote, no sissy stuff. Men are to avoid being feminine, show no weaknesses, and hide intimate aspects of their lives. Now, in context of what we're talking about here, the boys' own father, Captain Hamilton, didn't even share with them his highest military honor, a battlefield commission to captain on the beaches of Normandy. Now, we know that what that means in context right now. We've all seen Saving Private Ryan, right? And the Distinguished Service Cross. Their CO at West Point knew their father better than they did.
Yeah. It rings totally true for the era, I suppose. But it just seems so weird now that we are showing as little emotion, after that, one flash of raw emotion in the previous scene. It's jarring. Now, there is one thing that is missing, and I wonder if you were curious about this as well. Why is Robert at West Point? Is it just because he is from a military family and he is expected to be there? Now, I ask this because that is not an entirely unreasonable expectation. Several years ago, when I was having a year of short-term jobs, I played a civilian role in some National Guard exercises when I lived reasonably close to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. We were basically walking, talking props in indigenous clothing. Indigenous if you were going to be shipping out to the Middle East soon. We were there to not get shot, and spoiler, we got shot quite a bit. It was kind of like laser tag with blanks. It was really noisy, and that was kind of unnerving at times for me, but it was also kind of fascinating. we would sit and we would eat field rations with these guys who were just shooting at us when they weren't supposed to be, because the exercise was being reset, all the pieces were being moved back into place, and we were going to have to do this well into the night. I remember having a conversation with one of the full-time Army sergeants overseeing the exercises, because he was training these members of the National Guard who were about to ship out. And we had a conversation about how he got into the service. And it was drilled into him by his own father that if he wanted to have a voice at the family table, and I remember that phrase exactly, word for word, this is what he said, if he wanted to have a voice at the family table, he had to put in his time in the service. Didn't matter which branch. In fact, he had already done a stint with the Marines and retired, and then enlisted with the Army when civilian life turned out to not suit him, or, he just wasn't able to adjust to it again. And I think this is fascinating because we're at a point in time in the 50s where we are just now getting into the expectation that with a college education or what have you, maybe you're going to do something different than what your father did. At that point in time, is very common. Dad was a soldier, you're going to be a soldier. Dad was a farmer, you're going to be a farmer. Dad's a banker, you're going to be a banker. Probably because he's going to pull some strings and get you into these, or you're going to inherit the family farm, or what have you. In the 50s, it was actually kind of an outlier for you to deliberately aim to do something different.
We did talk about in observations that the opening, establishing shot was the Hamilton's house. It's a gorgeous, again, three-peak roof house, Tudor style, suburban America, very affluent by just the sheer size of it. And I'm wondering if they're making a correlation here of if you were in the shoes of, at one point in time, Captain Hamilton, then you rotated out of the Army since you were lucky enough to survive World War II. And then the discipline that you learned from being, I assume that he was a West Pointer. So the discipline that you learned from West Point that allows you to do your job with distinction, not just any service, but with distinction and with a battlefield commission, obviously gave you a certain level of prominence when you came back to the world, which allowed you to succeed because your job application would probably have a resume that was just absolutely laced with sterling recommendations. That, I believe, is what Joel probably saw. Because Joel's like, okay, this is the way that my dad succeeded. This is the way that I can succeed. But maybe, to your point, when Joel sees this, when Robert sees this, I'm getting the brothers mixed up all the time. It's so funny, too, because, my brother Marv and I, we don't look anything alike, and our names aren't even really similar except for the one syllable. So it's like Marv and Norm. This is like Robert and Joel. Anyway, I'll get to siblings later. But Robert sees it as a measure of success and a pathway to success. Joel. Robert sees this as, you know what? I can just lean on the merits of my father and my older brother when I get to West Point. You know why? Because I already have the inside track. And I think that that's the whole point of this. You can't shortcut what I think is kind of being proposed here as the family legacy. Their father didn't tell them any of what he did. The legacy of his father is what kind of it survives him beyond the grave. That is duty, honor, loyalty, the things that Joel says to Robert that you can't just shortcut. You have to earn them, you have to live them, they have to be part of you. Now, I'm not sure if I exactly agree with I will live or die for this organization. That's not how I was raised or what I believe per se. But that's what they did. And I can see there's a really wonderful dichotomy between the two brothers saying okay, we were both raised by this man. Obviously, one of them saw, success one way and one of them saw success another way. But in the end, it all reconciles to what's the family legacy? How am I supposed to be able to carry on as the future, of our family?
This is where I think that establishing shot of the house speaks volumes, because the moment you see that, you know that Robert isn't just doing this because of the GI Bill is going to get him into college.
Exactly, yeah.
Obviously, he'd get into college anytime he wants. They've got the money. They can afford it.
Right, and you would think that would translate to, okay, so Robert can kind of coast. I'm sorry, Joel can kind of coast. He can be soft, but he's not, right? And maybe that's why Joel's probably pushing himself harder, because he's like, you know what, I'm not going to have these other officers say like, oh, well, you got in here because your old man was here, or somebody who knows somebody, that's why you got in here. Robert's counting on that. Joel's like, no, that's not me. That's not the way I was raised. And Joel says to Robert, that's not the way that you should act either, because that's not the way that you were raised, right? So why are you doing this? And I like that there's a little bit of a flex there with Joel's like, he can do. I mean, Robert can do what his brother can do. He can do it. It's not that he can't. It's just that he's like, why should I? But I think that's the whole point. That's Joel's whole point. It's like, look, you bested me. That is on paper. You've broken like all of my, the goals and expectations of you of a cadet. That is on paper. So where's that attitude coming from? You keep saying that, well, I just want to best you. But there's got to be more to it than that. It's like you actually are showing the reason why you were raised a certain way is because you can do better than you can think you can do yourself. That's the way our father raised us, right? So you're just proving the point that you're trying to disprove. And I think he realizes that at the end when Joel gives him his father's rank bars. He's like, this is who Dad raised you to be. You can try and ignore that. You can try and subvert that. But at the end of the day, this is who you are. I'm wondering, though, if that's the reason why this particular episode was created, because was it created specifically for military families to see that in themselves, right? It's not just a ne'er-do-well officer and a stickler to the rules like we did last week. This is a family built on legacy, right? And a very specific point about that. What do you think, Earl? Did you get that when you saw this episode?
Yeah, this is a very different animal from the operator and the martinet, because with that episode, we speculated that Robert Vaughn's character maybe was the boy from the wrong side of the tracks.
Right.
And that he was going to be pulling these schemes and doing these things on the side, regardless of whether or not he enlisted in the Army. It's a very different story altogether, and yes, it's aimed at a family audience anyway. But, to your point, so many young men enlisting at West Point at this period in time, so many of them probably had their father's legacies to live up to. And not just West Point, but Annapolis.
Right.
All of the military academies for all of the branches. And so it's kind of useful in focusing and framing that question for the audience.
So here's something that we haven't done in a while, Earl. We haven't done the title game. We do that on Mission Log Standard, but sometimes we do it here on Gene-ology. The title game. So the phrase thicker than water, it's a well-known axiom, blood is thicker than water. The brothers Hamilton, Joel and Robert, they're at odds with each other, and they probably have been their entire life. But then their father's killed in this car accident. And Robert's about to quit until his brother gives him his father's rank bars. Is this the actual truest moment that the title of this episode is referencing? How many men, young men, boys, young men that were watching this episode at the time connected with this moment? Because up until their commanding officer said who their father was in terms of his military career, they had no idea. I'm not even sure if Mrs. Hamilton, based on her reaction, in that scene, basically the 2 minutes that she was in, if she even knew. So I'm wondering if the ties that blood is thicker than water kind of culminates in that moment where Joel's trying to explain to his brother that the only reason why you turned your whole attitude around was just to best me. Is this really the reason why you wanted to do this? Is there another reason? Or in the realization of what Robert was able to do, did he know that in some way both his father and his brother have helped shape him, and he's now come full circle? And whatever happened in the past can't erase the fact that they're still family, and the family legacy now continues on with Robert. That's the way I saw it. How did you see it?
I think you're right on the money there. Remember, early in the episode, when Joel is talking to his two fellow senior cadets as he's coming out of the barracks after that first encounter with Robert kind of goes south very quickly. He tells them that Robert got used to Joel fighting his battles through school.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was clearly an older brother, younger brother dynamic where younger brother gets picked on and older brother comes in swinging. You have that dynamic for years and it kind of conditions you. So it could be that Robert is conditioned to expect that his brother will swoop in and save the day. But there's a certain snarkiness to it from very early in the episode that makes it really difficult to sympathize with Robert if that's the case. And again, we have 26 minutes of show. We don't have time to do flashbacks or set up the entire family history, so a lot is left unsaid and we have to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and that goes into this whole aspect of sibling rivalry, because I think that also is a huge component in this episode, and it's not even really mentioned, per se. But there's one line in there that I think it's kind of I think where Robert and Joel are in their relationship at the time. Not even just in West Point, but I think their entire lives. And he said, Robert says this to Joel. He says, "I have everything it takes to beat you. And that is what I am interested in, sir." That's all he wants, right? He just wants to beat his older brother. And all his older brother wants to do is to kind of take care of him and clean up after him because, you know what? If I don't, nobody else will. And I think that's kind of if you have an older brother or if you have an older sister or if you have older siblings or cousins, sibling rivalry is a real thing, right? I think people out there can agree with that, right? And I think that Gene writes them pitch perfect in that sense, even though it's not highly, dramatized in this episode because it's just the tone. You can feel it that you have Joel being the older brother, towing the party line for the family as he was raised or quote unquote programmed or conditioned to do. And then you have Robert, who is basically, like you said, Earl, is just waiting for the older brother to clean up after him as he's done time and time again because he doesn't respect him enough to let him stand on his own 2 feet. Sound familiar? Sibling rivalry folks out there, right? But I understand where Robert's coming from. I have an older brother and I have a younger brother, and my younger brother will probably say, yeah, I know exactly where Robert is coming from because big brothers push their little brothers really hard, regardless of if it's in school or if it's in sports or if it's an extracurricular, whatever. Because I do think that, at least from my experience, I do think that my older brother wanted me to be better than him because he has the other responsibilities that I will never have. So you know what? You don't have to worry about towing the family line. You don't have to worry about impressing dad as the number one son. You don't have to worry about taking responsibilities when dad's gone. So you should be able to be better than me because you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And I think that that's what Joel was trying to do with Robert. And I think Robert really understood it at the end. It doesn't always work out that way, for sure. But as somebody who's experienced that dynamic personally, I felt very connected, to their story.
All right, Norm, we're here at the end of the show. It's our duty to figure out what the messages, morals, and meanings in Thicker Than Water were. What are your thoughts here?
I mean, most of the episode, I think, has been this very interesting prelude, to our wrap-up, where we're finding these morals, meanings, and messages. Because I do think that, I know that it's not always obvious with some of Gene's earlier work, and we've had to kind of dig a little bit and maybe make certain assumptions of this is what I think that Gene was getting to. But I think that in this episode, it's very, I wouldn't say it's obvious, but it's very well crafted through just these excellent performances, with William Campbell and Corey Allen as the brothers. Because we're seeing almost kind of role reversal, a soft role reversal with both of them when they, reconcile themselves, with each other and what it means. And I think that that's the meaning of this particular episode. It's this unspoken code of duty, honor, and loyalty, but not where it's so pressed into them from one, standpoint of their lives or another. It's just, I think that's something that subliminally they were raised to believe. Again, Robert, he has the skill to do what needs to be done as a West Point cadet. He proves that, right? You can't just all of a sudden just will yourself into being the best at calisthenics, or the best at cleaning your room, or the best at coming to attention, or the best at scanning information. That happens because you somehow were trained to believe or act that way. And maybe that was, organically or by osmosis or, subconsciously through being raised by their father, Captain Hamilton. But I really do think that when you look at these two specific examples, and not necessarily from this episode, I think it really kind of crystallizes what this episode is about and the morals, meanings, and messages that I pulled from it. When Joel discovers the truth about why his brother radically changed his attitude, and, some will say for the better, he made sure that his brother really understood the code of West Point, and maybe arguably the code of men in this era. And a quote, Joel says to Robert, "Duty isn't something you accept to prove someone's wrong. Honor isn't something you follow just to keep from being disciplined. Loyalty isn't something you have just to get on top. These are things you believe in because they are right, because they are a part of you." Now, that's very well possible that Robert really learned that from West Point, but I do think that both Joel and Robert learned that from their father in one way or another, where it was, hey, you know what? Be the best at being in the football team. Be the best in academics. Be the best in doing your civic duty. We don't know that because we don't have the time to see it. But it also kind of reminds me of another scene from another, and these two scenes are worlds apart, decades apart. But it reminds me of a parallel scene in probably one of the greatest speeches in movie history. And this is Jack Nicholson as Colonel Nathan Jessup in A Few Good Men, when he says to Lieutenant Caffey about his attitude or lack of respect, the words that describe the code of military service. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. And I think that's where Robert kind of was at the beginning. He's like, well, my brother's going to clean up after me. My brother is your brother. It doesn't matter. We don't have to really work that hard because we're just going to kind of skirt right by. That was him at the beginning. At the end, something different. And I believe, it's the way I was raised. I believe that when you commit yourself to a goal, whether it's a personal goal or an organizational goal or a belief, I think that you should pursue it with the noblest of intentions and purpose. And maybe that's where this episode is. Maybe that's where Gene is crafting, the message of this episode, because Joel believed he was responsible as the older brother to a fault to take care of Robert, and to take care of his family. And Robert maybe he didn't benefit in the same way that Joel thought he was, because his big brother was always cleaning up his messes, right? This is where that sibling rivalry I was talking about was coming from. So I think that in the end, when they finally realized what their father imparted on them in a bit of wisdom, when they finally saw his service, and when their commanding officer says, some men just don't talk about it in that way. They just feel that it is what their duty is to do, this kind of service. They became their best selves. They found that one part of each other that reconciled themselves as family in the end, in that beautiful moment where Joel gives Robert his father's bars. And I see this the same way that Hamarovs and Towns were in The Operator and the Martinet. They're both missing one key element in each other that the other has in order to become the best version of the officer that their commanding officers believe they can be. And I think that maybe this is the pattern. This is the theme that we're seeing in this new era of Gene's work. Gene's seeing these characters that are almost there, except for the one thing that they can't see about themselves that someone else has to be able to show them in one way or another. And I think that we see that later on in Star Trek. But again, that's a road that I'm really excited that we can, start to map out. What did you think about this episode, Earl?
You and I landed on the exact same line from this episode. So there went my notes, but I have no counter for that. I think you landed right on it. The story is about each of these men realizing that not only does each of them have something valuable that the other one could take on board, but that they also have inherited different things from their father that informs things going forward. And that perhaps they don't realize that until he is gone, and until they recognize that in each other.
If we're looking at this from a Star Trek analogy, this is the Tholian web, right? You know, there's a scene where Kirk says, Spock is going to have to rely on McCoy. McCoy's going to have to rely on Spock. They're going to have to find some way to be able to rely on each other and put their petty differences aside in order to complete the mission and get the ship to safety or to get the ship home. And that just doesn't come, you know, from a great writer all the time. The impetus of that idea, that has to come from somebody who's experienced that before. And I don't think that we've gone further back enough into Gene's personal history to see if that was the case, because I don't think we have the resources for that. We certainly don't have any diaries or biographies of that kind of nature to be able to go into the psychology of Gene and say, okay, that's the moment when he became this. That's the reason why he went to become a bomber pilot. This is the reason why he went to become a commercial airline pilot and then a writer. I don't see the pattern in those choices from him, but writers write what they know, as we've said before. And in doing so, there has to be something or someone or an experience that he's seen that has led him to start creating this as a template, you know, for other episodes that we've seen from other series that lead up to Star Trek.
We do have some blinders on doing this podcast in that we are examining scripts, we are examining shows. We do not have personal correspondence, diaries, or anything like that. We're trying to find the man in his work. And I think we are finding more of him now than we have been in the past. And again, playing the title game just a little bit, Thicker Than Water, this does not sound like an episode title from Mr. District Attorney or Highway Patrol. This sounds like a title that Gene gave his own script. And so I think we really are, you know, as you said, on the road toward what he would bring to Star Trek. You know, at the very least, we are on the on-ramp to that road. You know, we are very firmly there. And this is yet another script that shows that very well. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory players. Our cast this week featured Ross Gallo as Cadet Joel Hamilton, Jared Ballard as James, and Michael Roman as Ed. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, Man of Action. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.